Good morning, everybody. Okay, so the business that I'm in is I'm an industry research analyst, and what that means is I count things, classify them, put things in context, and so on. And what we are talking about here today is the impact of open source on the communication service provider capital spending trends. And so what we did was we took a look at our research. What we do at 650 Group is we have 21 research areas that we cover, and for each of them we publish a report that comes out every quarter that has forecast and market share, so for 21 different industries. And some of them are impacted by what we can say cord related. I realize that everyone in the room here probably has an idea of what's involved, but I'll just kind of step through how we have looked at what's going on here. So what we did was looked at what projects that are underway with ONF, and they involve things like broadband access, metro Ethernet, and on, as you can see on the list, and then kind of mapped that to our research and our forecast for each of them. And the general idea here is that if you take a look at each of these projects that are underway that have been discussed in technical terms, we pretty much added them up. And I want to share with you just how big this market is that we're all talking about here at this conference. If you look over the next 5 years, what we're talking about is, from the standpoint of equipment and software over the next 5 years, we're talking about almost $500 billion in capital spending. This is an enormous opportunity that is underway now. Now, if you look through the pie chart that I've got here on the presentation slide, well, you can see one of the biggest parts of this opportunity is the radio access network. This is a very complex part of the network, and there's a great deal of incumbency with vendors. And there are other parts of the network that have actually been discussed in more detail these days. I guess you could say, or at least from an analytical standpoint, these are the more immediate targets. They include broadband access and evolved packet core and other sort of telecom core areas, and optical transport and routing. So these, generally speaking, are the sizes of the market that we're talking about here at this conference. I realize how silly it is for me to say broadband is easier, but I had to make a comparison between broadband and RAN. That's why I say such a thing as broadband is easier. And well, you get the idea. As operators move to open source on a project, what we see is the adoption will roll out over time. Of course, the reasoning behind adopting things like cord-related systems is to potentially reduce operating savings and also to improve service agility, get the services out sooner and in a differentiated way. Okay, so the message here on the slide is big market. Okay, as I said earlier, broadband and telecom core are, I say, easy targets. Easier is more like it. We've done some work here in other market trends, and basically the idea is we've seen what type of technology we perceive to be the more immediate ones for moving to open source and open hardware. Now, one of the things that I've looked at is where are the margins? Where are the places where we can apply new technology, new approaches, and find ways to save money? Okay, that's why I have this gross margin line. So if you look at broadband access, what I'm talking about is the gross margins of a broadband access vendor selling to the operator community. Gross margins, I know, are across the board different from vendor to vendor, but it's generally a 30% gross margin. That means that if these vendors sold stuff at cost, it would be 30% cheaper. And that's not going to happen, but there's quite a bit of room to work with. And this represents about 16% of the total addressable market. And you can see, working our way down the chart, that there's about 35% gross margin, give or take, to work with across the areas that are being discussed here as being targets. And what I think we can safely say here is that the broadband and core are very large opportunities and have a great deal of merchant technology sources. What do I mean by merchant technology sources? What I'm talking about is you can buy chips, like Broadcom chips for switching. You can buy radio technology or other types of processor systems that can be applied that may or may not be available directly from systems companies. And we have seen this type of workaround in the hyperscaler market, where you can buy a Broadcom chip, have an ODM work with a company who's maybe a hyperscaler, and not need to buy from a company like Cisco. Okay, so we've seen this type of activity in other markets, and it has been surprisingly successful as a way to both reduce gross margin paid and serve markets efficiently. Okay. So what's happening here on this slide is I'm making a comparison, which has been made before. Communication service providers can leverage what has already been done by hyperscalers. Now, it would be too easy to say they're the same thing. In other words, hyperscaler computing systems and the networks that connect them are not, in fact, the same from what communication service providers build. But what we can say is that the hyperscalers have made the transition to adopting open. So that is a similarity. And what I want to also point out is there are some differences. In the case of hyperscalers, each of the very large ones has enough scale on their own to develop their own ecosystem of suppliers. And that is, in my view, not the case for the communication service provider market. Each telecom service provider is not large enough to demand that suppliers work with them to meet their needs and force adoption of open source. But together, I believe that this is actually achievable, and that's what's happening here today. So to the extent that communication service providers work together and have enough scale to request or demand a change in the industry, I think this can be quite successful. And later I'll show you just how successful I think it can be. The other difference is, of course, between a hyperscaler network and a communication service provider network is we're talking about a very different scale of network. Well, communication service provider have hundreds of thousands of edge locations and trillions of dollars of services revenue, and that's a very different type of network. So when we make comparisons between hyperscaler and communication service provider, it's important to know they are quite different, and we recognize that. Okay, so in my world, I look at things that have happened in the past and things that are likely to happen in the future, and the analogies usually work. So what I'd like to do is share with you some 10-year journeys that have happened in the past. Of course, cloud hyperscalers have adopted open source and open hardware, introduced new suppliers. You can safely say that white box has been adopted in the hyperscaler market, and today, or actually a couple of years ago, open source, open hardware is now at mass adoption at the hyperscalers. I don't think that's too much of a stretch here, and I think you could even say, yeah, it's already happened. In my research of the telecom market, I've also spent a great deal of time researching network functions virtualization, and we've mapped out what of the telecom equipment boxes, more telecom core, are virtualized, let's say. And that is a trend that is almost complete. I wouldn't say fully complete, but in about 4 or 5 years, I believe that NFV will be what we could consider at mass adoption. And following the analogy here, I think it's a good framework to say that the ONF cord has been introduced. We're now in trials, and deployments will begin in about the period of time starting this year and next year, and open adoption is maybe 5 years out. So that's the analogy that we're going with here. And just to share with you a little bit more, I want to talk about what happened, or what is now happening, with NFV, just to drive this one a little further. So NFV licenses and sessions, the way we count them, has undergone a sort of a 0 to fast adoption, and we're now at various rates according to technology types like telephony application server, CSCF, and so on, is now at this point where you can safely say the market has adopted it. also, nearly every vendor now has adopted NFV as the way to approach the marketplace. Now, I wouldn't say that NFV has led to like a disaggregation of network technology at all. Basically, this happened, but it hasn't resulted in every advantage, I think, as was the initial view, but you get the idea that every vendor has adopted NFV. Okay, so what we did here is took a look at the cord market and held a survey contacting telecom operators and asked a bunch of questions, right? So the idea here is we asked, what is the top ranked open source project you're working on? And what we found was actually pretty similar to what we've heard here at the conference, which is broadband access is the top ranked open source project, followed by mobile core. And then a little bit further down, you'll see the top rank is mobile RAN or optical transport. If you dig in a little further on our survey, you'll see that some operators are looking at mobile RAN and optical transport as maybe the second or third or fourth priority. But the point is we've made contact with telecom operators, asked what's important, and here's what we get. Not to spend too much time in everything here on this chart, but I wanted to also communicate that operators have responded here to this survey and said, we are either highly confident or confident that mass adoption of open source will occur by the year 2023 in 85% of the cases. That is a really big percentage of respondents saying, we're doing this. It's going to happen soon. And so I'm quite encouraged when I see these numbers. The boxes in the middle basically say the use of open source and open hardware will grow. So that's what we have on the survey that we did leading into this presentation. And what we see is what will be impacted by open source. Here's kind of something of the conclusion of our research here. So broadband access is, in our view, based on our analogies we've come up with, as I was sharing with you earlier, and the survey results, and our work in covering the telecom industry, we think that by about 5 years from now, we're likely to see broadband access have some element of open source and open hardware associated with 62% of the dollars that are involved with the broadband access market, and Metro Ethernet and RAN and so on. The point here is that we're likely to see much earlier adoption in certain areas, and by about year 5, about 37% of the capital spending is likely to be associated with open source and open hardware. And in the 5th year, that would equate to about $36 billion. It's a pretty big number, actually, if you think about it. We're thinking that that's enough of a reason to continue focusing on these efforts. Okay. Second to the last slide. So we added up the first 5 years impact of that $490 billion, and what we are expecting is that in the first 5 years, about $73 billion of capital spending will be impacted by open source and open hardware. And broadband access is likely to be the first of these, and we're expecting radio access network to be quite a few years down the line. You can see the gray pizza slice here is one of the smaller ones, even though it is one of the larger opportunities. I think it'll happen a bit more in the future. Okay, to summarize, we expect open source adoption in communications service provider networks depends very much on how closely service providers work together. As I said, hyperscalers are big, they can do this on their own, make their own stuff. I do not think that that is the case with the telecom service provider market. But working together, there can be significant savings, and that is, I think, one of the key elements of success here. The other thing that's happening here is the communication service providers are need to sort of kickstart this effort, and it is underway, but I don't think that you'll find vendors alone will do this, will adopt open source on their own, and I think that most in the room would fully agree with that. Now, I wanted to share something with you that I kind of alluded to this earlier. I do not believe that incumbent vendors will cooperate with adopting open source all that much. I saw something similar happen with NFV, and that's kind of why I made the comment that while we have NFV as a large percentage of what's shipping, basically a lot of that is on the hardware from the same vendors. So there's sort of like they co-opted the effort. So that is a pretty important, let's say, sub-conclusion of our research here. I think that to the extent that the operators do not work together and sort of push the agenda, it seems to me the incumbents will kind of act as they've done in the past. And it provides a heck of an opportunity for new vendors to come in and really make a difference. But I just wanted to share our observation of what has happened in other technology evolutions. I do expect that communication service providers will experience CapEx savings if the opportunity is big enough for new vendors. In other words, the community here, if it works with new vendors and provides enough of a profit opportunity, that will sort of be shared in CapEx savings. And for the last point I'd like to share, just to reiterate, 85% of the service providers that we contacted are confident that in the next 4 or 5 years, they will begin adopting open source or having mass adoption of open source. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions from the audience? I think this is really a monumental time and really an interesting year for ONF, ONF Connect, and our community at large. Starting this morning with the Comcast deployments and then hearing some of these kinds of numbers. The scale of these numbers is really phenomenal, and the scope and breadth of the markets we're touching and impacting is really quite remarkable. Any question?
Sure, why not?
Hey, Brian.
Good morning, Chris. Brian Zonsker, Power Rocks. Thanks for the overview. What I'm curious about is with how your research be applied to the, basically in the white box market, right? The white box, the CMs and folks, and the have more or less cannibalized a good portion of the SAM out there from the traditional OEMs in the hardware market and all that, right? So. Based on your conclusion there, it leads me to believe that that trend will only continue and increase. So I was just wondering if you can kind of comment on the basically continued cannibalization of the CMs, sucking up truly the majority of the $60 billion server market, even when it technically kind of falls under the major OEMs who are still buying it from all the CMs.
Okay. Right, so what's happening is, let's say at the hyperscalers, there's actually a surprisingly large percentage of hardware that is purchased that is non-branded. Yeah. And that is, like I said, the ship has already sailed there. Right, yeah. Branded systems players are not having much success with the big hyperscalers. But we do not actually see today that is the case with, communication service providers. Most of this is branded equipment from vendors we know very well, like Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei, ZTE, Cisco, and so on. So to say there's an opportunity would be an understatement. There's quite an opportunity because of the differences in cost structures, the disaggregation trend that we've heard about today. And but I don't think you can say white box has taken over the communication service provider market. I think that would be very much a forward-looking comment as opposed to that we're here today. So does that address what you're
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
And Bill?
Hey, thanks, Don. Chris, thanks for putting numbers and dates to this transformation. Really good insight.
Thanks.
Any observations about which regions, geographies of the world that we'll see as kind of fast movers or kind of later adopters?
Regions. Okay, so I've actually found that this can happen anywhere, really. It all depends on what my view is what the legacy is. So, for instance, in the U.S. market, we saw that like VoLTE happened on proprietary boxes, even though NFV was happening. And that was because decisions were made about what equipment to move, when to deliver voice over LTE, right before the NFV thing started happening. And VoLTE works great in the U.S. Across the carriers, but at the very same time, it made sense to pursue voice over LTE. Just the decisions were not made in sequence, right? So I think you'll actually see adoption of open source and open hardware roll out quite in no particular geography at any time. And there's just so many staggered decisions that are happening across many different access parts of the network. And I wouldn't really point to any geography as trend breaking from what I can tell.
Well, that's probably good for us.
I think it probably is.
Thank you.
Okay.
One more question?
Thanks for the insight. So based on your observation that basically about the opportunity for new vendors being big enough, you think this is something that will be most accessible just for the big CSPs, or also smaller operators will be able to leverage open source by moving in a slightly different way?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, okay, so the thing I was trying to communicate here is that I think if telecommunications service providers work together, it's likely that this will move forward much more successfully. And part of my reasoning for saying that is that if you're not of scale and don't have engineering resources in-house that can allow you to kind of do this on your own, it's going to be tough. And I saw the same general thing happen with the adoption of NFV, where even if you were a smaller operator and wanted to adopt NFV, you'd pretty much just go to Nokia, Ericsson, Huawei and say, I want NFV, but I want you to sell it all to me, okay? And that's, you know what I'm saying? It's not really the initial vision, but it counts. It checks the box for NFV, and I hope my cynicism here isn't going too far, but anyway, you get the idea. That's what I meant by incumbents co-opting the trend. So I think if you have more engineering resources in-house and you try to do it yourself, you're much more likely to be successful. And if you're smaller, it's going to be tough. So that's why I'm advocating for a coalition here. That make sense? Okay, thank you.
Good. Well, Chris, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.